James, let's start at the beginning. When did you realise that you wanted to be an MP, and did you ever give any consideration to it being with any other party than the Green Party?
I decided while I was doing postgrad in the UK, we had spent a lot of time really getting under the hood of climate change and so on, and the kind of the scale of it was sort of overwhelming. So it just became, for me, in many ways, the obvious place. Like that's what I have to do. Did I? Yes. I mean, initially, I first joined the Green Party as a teenager, right? So it sort of that was kind of in my blood. I did look at the policy platforms of every party, and found that I agreed and disagreed with all of them in roughly equal measure. So that wasn't going to kind of help. And so ultimately, it was pretty easy just to come back and say, that it was the Greens, because they are the only party that prioritised climate change above other considerations.
I mean, before coming into Parliament, you had worked for the likes of PricewaterhouseCoopers, HSBC. Quite a different path, I guess, to many other Green MPs. How much do you put your background and sort of where you came from into Parliament down to the perceptions and the assumptions, I guess, that people have made about you, and also those multiple attempts to oust you as co-leader? How much of that was tied up in it?
Oh, well, I mean, first of all, I think that, the Green Party has, a broad array of people, from different backgrounds. Like you say, yes, that, it was unusual for the caucus to include sort of people with a corporate background like I had. But I felt that shouldn't, we should never exclude anyone on the basis of their kind of background. And that ultimately everyone kind of brings different things to the party. So that never really was an issue for me. It's certainly, there are some people, not a large number of people, but there are some people for whom, that they clearly didn't identify with me, and that's fine. And we're looking for, someone who they did.
Did anyone ever raise with you during those multiple attempts to oust you as co-leader that was part of the problem, that they didn't kind of connect, I guess, with you and where you came from? No, I mean, not really in those, the kind of those two ones during the last term, but more, I'd sort of have conversations with people at conferences or, campaign events or things like that. And that had sort of been around for a long time. Like I was really aware of that, when I first kind of joined. So it's always been a feature. But I also think, frankly, everybody has, all our MPs and all of our candidates who want to become MPs, there will be some people amongst our base of members and supporters who don't identify with those people, and you kind of hear those grumblings. I think they tend to be more acute when you're in a leadership position than a regular member of caucus. I mean, there are National Party voters who like you. They don't necessarily vote for you, but they're pretty open with you. I mean, they tell you that they like you and that they're sad that, you're leaving the Green Party. What do you make of that? Well,
I mean, there are Green Party members and supporters who like some national MPs too. I think it's really important in politics that we don't get so stuck in our tribal kind of gangs that we can't see the good qualities in people who don't belong to our tribe. If we kind of end up going down that path, you end up where the US is, and to some extent other countries like Canada or Britain or Australia, and I think that's really risky. I think it's important as political leaders, to be grounded in our values and our ideals and what it is that we stand for, but to be able to, communicate and to connect with people who we disagree with or who disagree with us. And I also think it's really important for us to try and see those qualities in other people as well.
Let's talk about the election campaigns you've been involved in as co-leader. 2017, you became the sole leader.
It was a doozy.
Just weeks out from that election, of course, Matiria Ture admitted benefit fraud. She eventually, of course, resigned as co-leader, leaving you as the only one there. It seemed at the time like you were basically just trying to keep the lights on.
Mm-hmm. I think I've even used that phrase myself.
I've stolen it, sorry. What went through your head
each day of that campaign, and how much weight had you put on yourself? How much pressure had you put on yourself that if the Green Party didn't get across that 5% threshold, that would have been on your watch and your watch only?
Oh, it was that was the most horrible feeling. The day that the House rose on 6 weeks out from Election Day, I gave the adjournment debate speech. So Parliament, we weren't going to see each other for 6 weeks, and 10 minutes before I went and did that speech, I got the Colmar-Brunton polling that we had an 11-point drop, and we were on 4%, so we were underwater. And so I had to give that speech knowing that there was a realistic possibility that it was going to be the last speech by a Green Party Member of Parliament.
Your valedictory speech in 2017?
Yeah, essentially, but not just mine. If it was just mine, that would have been a lot easier than, 20 years of history and all of those other MPs that had fought so long to try and get us into government. So that was one of the lowest points of that particularly rough campaign. And then, what went through my mind? We worked incredibly hard. We knew that the job was to be back in Parliament, and so that's what we worked on. The funny thing is that we got the polls back pretty consistently above 5% within about 3 or 4 weeks of that, and then we were pretty comfortable by the time in the 2-week voting period before Election Day. I think we kind of knew that we were safe in that sense, and I actually quite enjoyed the last couple of weeks, and the response was quite good.
For those of us covering at the time, it felt like Matiria Ture, she had made that decision to be transparent about benefit fraud, and that it was very last minute. It felt a bit sort of chaotic. You were obviously very new to the leadership at that point still. What was your gut instinct when she told you that she was going to be honest about that? Did you contemplate whether that was a good idea or a bad idea? And did you communicate that?
Yeah, well, to tell you the truth, I was pretty busy with my own speech that weekend as well. But you have to remember why she did it. I think a lot of people still look back at that speech and say she was admitting to benefit fraud almost as if she was trying to get it off her chest or something. That was not the point. The point was that she was trying to demonstrate that there are people whose situations are so dire they feel like they have no choice but to do that, and that she had been in that situation herself. And you got to remember that in the week or so, after that, our polling went up kind of 4 or 5 points. We were I think at one point we were on about 16, 17%. So people responded, they actually did respond to that. And then what happened was essentially the kind of the narrative and the opprobrium kind of shifted, and, she was essentially hounded, and kind of all of that sort of rationale for making the speech got sort of buried under this kind of attack.
You've talked about that initial boost that the party got. Jacinda Ardern and Labour, they kind of went into political mode. You saw them distancing themselves from the Green Party, and eventually Jacinda Ardern said that she wouldn't have Matiria Ture as a minister in her cabinet, in her government. What do you remember of that time? And were you angry with Labour and Jacinda Ardern and Grant Robertson and how they handled that?
No. I sort of, the way that I kind of chalk that up is, well, they had to kind of say what they had to say politically, right? They're a different political party. And at the same time, I also thought, well, if we're in a position to form a government after the election, it's a negotiation. So I know that every election campaign we love to play the rule in, rule out game, right? And everyone chases each other around, doing that. And then what happens is people actually get to vote, and then you get into a negotiation. And so I've always kind of taken all of that rule in, rule out stuff with a great big dose of salt.
Fair enough. The next story that broke, obviously, with Matiria was around the admitting that she'd enrolled at an address that she wasn't living at to vote for her friend. That felt like the moment when the wheels started to really fall off. Was that when you knew that she wasn't going to survive that?
Yeah, so I actually remember getting that phone call that night. I was in a van on my way to Otaki to do a public meeting there. And that was when I knew that we were in real trouble, because then it was clear people were just out looking for any piece of evidence that to kind of destroy the narrative that she'd put out there and to kind of paint her as this kind of bad person who was just a serial lawbreaker. And it's very hard to kind of fight that once it sticks.
Were you angry about how all that played out?
I mean, yes, I was. And also, frankly, I didn't have time to dwell on that because after her resignation, all I had to do was just focus on making sure that the Greens were back in government. So I really had to park a lot of that.
Do you think that the Green Party and Matiria need to take the bulk of the responsibility for how that played out, or do you think there were other forces at play more so?
Well, I mean, hindsight's a wonderful thing, right? I mean, I could argue that we either could have done a better job of doing like a sort of a critical analysis of that, before we did it, to say, how might this play out and so on and so forth. But I'm not going to take all of the responsibility for that, because I do think that the way that it played out was sort of symptomatic of this larger trend that we have of kind of a real negative personality-based politics where people try to undermine each other as people rather than to kind of focus on the sort of policy positions and the kind of argument about how we want to be as a country. And so, you could say, perhaps we were being naive about that, but I also think we should have a style of politics that enables us to say these things, right? So you don't want to end up in a situation where people effectively can't tell the truth because they're so fearful of the backlash.
During that campaign, it became pretty clear that New Zealand First was going to be the kingmaker and that both National and Labour would end up in a position negotiating. Did you talk to anyone in National during that period when you were the sole leader about working with them?
No.
Why not?
Well, I mean, first of all, to tell you the truth, I'm not sure I talked to anyone in Labour either. I think we were just so busy focusing on the campaign that we just thought, well, we'll deal with that after the election. We had done, we'd started some work inside the Greens about, what a negotiation could look like, and we played a number of scenarios and, kind of gamed it out a bit. But, when after that kind of crash in our polling, we just had to park all of that work and just say our one job is to make sure that we're back in Parliament and we can, kind of deal with the day after.
So what about 2023 then? There were plenty of National supporters out there who were feeling a little bit uneasy about ACT and New Zealand First both being part of a coalition. Yeah. What conversations did you have with anyone in National during the 2023 campaign coalition talks?
During the coalition talks? Or during the
during the campaign and or coalition talks, did you talk to National at all during 2023?
Did we? During the campaign, I don't think so. Again, I think we were just focusing on the campaign. We had a good working relationship with Labour, and obviously we were campaigning pretty hard for a Labour Green government, and we thought that there was a real possibility that could be the result of the election. We also wanted to let our voters know that that's what we were campaigning for. I think it is really important that people know what they're casting their vote for, though most of them would recognise that other things can happen, right? After the election, I had a couple of conversations with Christopher Luxon and Nicola Willis, I went to brief them on climate change matters because I was still the acting climate change minister at the time. And I wanted to ensure that there was a smooth transition as well. And, you know, we kind of casually discussed it, but they were I mean, the onus is on them, right? So they never sort of said, should we, they never asked us to negotiate with them.
So in those conversations with Nicola and Christopher Luxon, had you spoken to the party about having any chats, or was this very informal, just you in a room with two other political colleagues?
No, it was actually both, right? So we'd had the discussion about, you know, if they call, and then it sort of became something of a moot point. And so, you know, my conversations with them were in my capacity as climate change minister, and you know, it's kind of pretty peripheral because they were pretty advanced in their negotiations with ACT and New Zealand First.
After that 2017 election, that was obviously your first as co-leader, the Greens went into government with Labour and New Zealand First. You'd always been close with both Jacinda Ardern and Grant Robertson. Did you always think that they had your back during that period when you were in government together? Were there tensions there?
Well, again, both things can be true. So yes, absolutely. I don't think that we would be where we are today on climate change without the personal leadership and sponsorship of both Jacinda Ardern and Grant Robertson, right? So they supported the work, and it was a personal priority for the Prime Minister. And I'm deeply appreciative of that because like I said, I don't think I could have done what I did without them. And there were tensions, right? There were plenty of arguments along the way about various things. The most obvious one that played out at the time was around agricultural emissions pricing. But there were others.
Any others that I guess were as bad in your mind as?
Well, the hardest, well, God, there were a lot of hard moments. But in terms of my relationship with them, nothing was as hard as agricultural emissions pricing. Just kind of reflecting how difficult it is for the country, you know, to kind of grapple with that particular challenge. I think I've said already that, you know, when we were setting our Paris target or upgrading the target that John Key had set, you know, there was some kind of, that was a tough conversation. Getting the emissions reduction plan written and over the line required just an amazingly complex set of you know, projects with about 16 different government departments, and that meant a whole bunch of ministers, and that was hard. But I never really felt like there was any great sort of philosophical, you know, parting of the ways.
Another thing people talk about as being hard is your time working with New Zealand First. With the benefit of hindsight, how difficult was it at the time? And what sort of reflections do you have, I guess, now looking back on that period working with them?
The funny thing is I never had any particular problems with any of their ministers. So we always kind of got on as people, which I don't think the government would have held together if we hadn't, you know. There were loads of kind of fairly well documented barneys, you know, but they generally kind of played out. And the thing about hindsight, you know, people can say, oh, you should have done more or whatever have you. I mean, it was, I mean, I know people talk about the current government as the first, you know, full three-way coalition, but actually we were in effect that because it required all three parties to agree to something, even though two of them were in cabinet, one of them wasn't. Our votes were required for anything. So we sat on every cabinet committee bar one. We saw every single cabinet paper except for the ones that were for that one that we weren't on, which was Foreign Affairs, Defence. And so we, you know, we were heavily integrated into government decision making in a way that we weren't in the second term, and so we had to work hard at that. And I think what people forget is we actually got a lot done in that term, and we only got it done because all three parties agreed, or at the very least consented. Some things took a while, and there were a lot of negotiations, and I don't think anybody ever got everything they wanted. But there was enough there that we could make it work.
What's your relationship like with Winston Peters?
I haven't spoken to him much recently. You occasionally bump into each other in the wall, and we're civil.
One day that stands out for many during the course of that government was March 15th. A lot of decisions had to be made around gun laws pretty quickly, with not a lot of information at times too.
Mm-hmm.
Were you brought into Cabinet at the time that those discussions
Yes.
were being had? And what are your memories of that time and how that was being decided amongst those three parties?
Well, it was remarkable, actually, and it did happen astonishingly quickly, given the speed at which government usually moves. But a lot of the work had already been done, because there had been, prior to March 15 in previous years, there had been select committee inquiries and recommendations made, and people had drafted legislation. So there was actually stuff on the shelf that was ready to go. And that was incredibly helpful, because so much of that work was so far advanced that it didn't require, it wasn't starting from scratch. The remarkable thing about the Cabinet Committee room was, kind of having the police in there, kind of illustrating for the ministers the actual kind of weaponry that we were talking about. And then some of the conversations around the table. The reason I'm being slightly stilted about this is because I'm still covered by Cabinet rules about what can be said. But it was a really high quality debate and a high quality conversation, because there were, gun users sitting around the table, right? Like, there are people who were hunters, and people had served in the military, and
So your Ron Marks, your Calvin Davises, for example.
Yeah. And so they, in many ways, shaped the conversation. And that was, I thought, it was, to me, it'll be one of the memories that I carry with me, because to me it was one of those moments where you actually saw that Cabinet decision-making process at its best, where we had, you say we didn't have a lot of information. We actually had quite a lot of information, and we had, really good briefings from the police and so on. And then we had the experience of the people in the room, and a kind of reasonably broad spectrum of opinion, and so it did kind of it did get a proper airing. As it should, and actually, frankly, as it would be nice if other matters were able to get that kind of attention.
The 2023 election, which is just last year, which is quite remarkable to believe at this point. At what point did you know that you were heading to opposition land?
Well, you didn't have to be a genius a year in advance to know that that was a likely scenario. And I think I had sort of resolved that for myself probably before Christmas of 2022. But I didn't want to die not knowing, and so we put everything into it, and we fought the best race that we've ever had. And I know I've become quite sanguine about election campaigns, because there's so much that you can't control. There's things that other political parties do, there's kind of economic trends, there's, global pandemics. There are just circumstances that you have no say in. And the best that you can do is just control what you can control, which is your own campaign. And so you can control the input, but you can't control the output. And so I had quite a lot of fun in the 2023 campaign, because
we were running a great campaign and we had the wind at our backs, and I felt our performance was really good, and I thought, well, if we don't win, at least we can say that we did our best.
I mean, by that point, presumably you knew you'd done your 6 years as climate change minister and you probably weren't going to get your 9. Do you leave satisfied with what you did? I mean, is it even possible in politics to leave satisfied, let's be honest?
Yes, I will say that it is, because I am. I mean, I certainly worked pretty bloody hard to get the 3rd term, and I would have liked to have done that. And I had it all. I had the sort of 3-term work program mapped out, and I knew exactly what the 3rd term was going to look like if we had gotten it. And at the same time, the work's never done, right? I mean, climate change isn't going to go away in 2029 magically, so 2026, sorry. So I had to, I just had to kind of resolve in my, for myself, well, what are the things that I want to be able to say I have done, and in such a way that I can trust that those things will continue after I've gone, which is, important, and then to be able to say, okay, I'm done. And so I always knew that there was at least a 50-50 chance that I wouldn't get the 3rd term, but I'm pretty satisfied with what I got done in the first 2.
Are you worried about the Green Party and whether it will have the same influence on those climate change issues cross-party and being able to get that bipartisan support in the way that you have, which largely has been about your personality and the way that you've done politics?
Well, it also comes of being in government. So I'm worried about the fact that the Greens aren't in government, because you don't have as much influence, and you certainly don't have as much information when you're in opposition. And so I'm, I kind of very much hope that they get back into government as soon as possible. I think the way that I think about the way that I conducted it is that I felt like all I was doing was applying a core Green Party principle of consensus, right? And of saying that we need, the big challenges of our time require us to step outside of our kind of tribal affiliations and the labels that we get placed upon ourselves. And that was, when I was 17-year-old, that was the thing that attracted me to the Greens in the first place, was that they wanted to do politics differently. And so I really carried that with me. And I talked a lot about it in my maiden speech. And I felt like all I was doing was what I had essentially been taught to do. So am I worried? No.
Just lastly, when you called time on politics, you told your friends, your family, your staff that you were done. What was the overwhelming feeling that came with that?
Relief. It's been the greatest privilege of my life, Joe. It really has. And it was the hardest thing I've ever done and probably will ever do. And, by the end of it, I was not in great shape. If we'd won a 3rd term in government, it would have definitely been my last, because I wouldn't have been able to physically or emotionally sustain another after that. And because I think I'd gone through my grieving process for being in government before the election, by the time I got to election night, I had a sense of relief for myself and a sense of real just kind of pride and joy that the Greens had had their best night in all of our history. And it's hard to walk away feeling sad about any of that.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.